Morrison government's religious discrimination bill made it to the parliament last week. It didn't get to a vote. Instead, the bill is being scrutinised by 2 parliamentary committees. Where's it up to? What do the changes mean? Let's go live to Father Frank Brennan, Rector of Newman College in Melbourne, also Adjunct Professor of Law at the Thomas More Law School at the Australian Catholic University. Frank Brennan, thanks so much for your time. What do you make of the religious discrimination bill as it's being considered now?
Well, Kieran, I think it's a bit like climate change. It's going round and round, or maybe the can's just being kicked down the road. Interesting to hear the Prime Minister there in the seat of Wentworth today. You might recall that during the Wentworth by-election in October 2018, the Prime Minister said the issue of discrimination against kids in religious schools should be fixed in a fortnight. Well, here we are 80 fortnights later, and it still hasn't been addressed. So what we've got is a situation where Attorney General Porter referred that matter to the Law Reform Commission. They were to report by April 2020. They then changed that to December 2020, and then without explanation it was to be done 12 months after any religious discrimination bill was considered. Well, for a lot of people, the treatment of kids is first and foremost. So that's one issue. The second is what to do about the employment of staff and finding the right mix there. Victoria has legislated in a way which is unsatisfactory to a lot of religious schools, so there's going to be a standoff between the Commonwealth and states on that. And then the third issue becomes, how do you allow a religious school to maintain its religious ethos? And trying to codify that into law is something which has been a great challenge for our politicians. It was hoped that it was to be fixed before the last election, when everyone went home for Christmas in 2018. Well, here they are going home for Christmas in 2021, once again hoping that it can be resolved by a parliamentary committee in February, and probably, like 3 years ago, it won't be. So it's quite a mess, and it's just a can that's been constantly kicked down the road.
Yeah, so in that context, how was it continually kicked down the road? Where are those markers where ministers might not have acted where they otherwise should have?
Yes. Well, I think the first marker is in terms of the treatment of children. What you've got to remember is that when the Ruddock Review was constituted by Prime Minister Turnbull to look at these issues in the wake of the same-sex marriage debate, it was found that the issues of religious freedom and religious discrimination were not separately dealt with in legislation, but were there as exceptions and exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act. And as it turned out, Labor had mistakenly legislated in 2013 in a way which really confused people as to the extent to which more conservative religious schools were able to go in order to discriminate. So in the wake of the Ruddock Review, what was said was there was a need for the states to clean up their act and for the feds to top it up if need be. Now, what we've had is a situation that by February 2019, there was a parliamentary committee. You had, for example, Archbishop Coleridge, the President of the Australian Bishops' Conference, telling Parliament, we're not interested in discriminating against kids. You had Senator Janet Rice from the Greens, who's a great, strong advocate for gays in the Parliament, saying that what was needed was legislation like in Queensland and Tasmania. And we had the person who headed the Catholic Education Commission for Queensland saying, look, we've lived with the Queensland law for years, that's fine. And so what we've had is a situation of just a standoff in relation to that question. When it comes to the employment of teachers, once again, the philosophical difference in the Parliament has been between those who say that there should be no choice at all for religious schools different from what there would be for state schools, over against those who say, well, no, philosophically, we've got to allow religious schools the same sort of discretion as, for example, Senator Rice or Mr Morrison or Mr Albanese might have in the selection of their personal staff for their electorate office or their ministerial office or their parliamentary office. They want to employ people who get with the message. they want to employ people who are sympathetic to the Greens or sympathetic to Labor. So why in a religious school can't you have principals of schools saying, well, we want people who we can appoint who can be there to get with the message. But then comes the really difficult issue for our politicians to deal with, and it's where there's been a change in community thinking, particularly in terms of those who are the rainbow people of our society, that particularly in a religious context, take for example the book of Genesis. Everyone knows that in the book of Genesis it said that, well, God created us male and female. Well, if you're no longer in a world of completely binary gender theory, is it said to be insulting to students or to staff to be teaching the book of Genesis? Now, as a religious person, I'd say we've got to be able to teach the book of Genesis, but at the same time, we've got to have a sympathy for all those who might be in our classroom or in our staff room.
In relation to the protection of students in schools, those who might be the subject of discrimination of some sort based on their sexual orientation, this is something you've raised, well, a number of years ago, at least 3 years ago, that you put this on the radar.
More than 3 years ago.
Why is it yet to be addressed?
Absolutely. It is absolutely farcical. And to think that last week, in the desperation to try and get a cobbled religious discrimination bill together, the Prime Minister indicated to some of his Liberal backbenchers that he might be able to fix that part of it immediately. Meanwhile, his previous Attorney-General had referred the matter to the Law Reform Commission, first to report by April 2020, second to report by December 2020, and then to say, oh no, we don't want to hear back from the Law Reform Commission until we've already got a religious discrimination bill in place. It just makes no sense at all to me, except to indicate that our Parliament on this sort of philosophical social issue has become completely unworkable.
And finally, almost out of time, but how important is it that Parliament deals with this legislation and provides some further support for against religious-based discrimination?
On the Ruddock panel, of which I was a member, we always acknowledged that there was an academic legal lacuna or lack in our system of discrimination laws. What's difficult for a lot of people to understand is that because we don't have a National Human Rights Act and because we've never done a sort of bringing together compatibly all of our different discrimination laws, there are lacuna and conflicts, and this has been one of the critical areas. Now, eventually that's got to be addressed by our Parliament at a national level, either with a National Human Rights Act or with a harmonisation of all our discrimination legislation, or thirdly, with a religious discrimination bill, but acknowledging that for a lot of religious people, they're not so much concerned about being discriminated against, they're more concerned to ensure that they can be discriminating in a positive sense in choosing the right people to be in their schools so that they can create a faith environment for the education of children when parents choose to have an education of that sort different from that in a state school.
Father Frank Brennan, I appreciate your time and your insights as always. Thanks.
Thank you, and good to be with you on your birthday, Kieran. Happy birthday.
Thanks, Father Frank. Talk to you soon.